All right, so once again, my name's Rachel, and I'm going to be your instructor for today's introduction to keyframing in ProShow Producer. And today we're going to talk about one of the most unique features inside ProShow that allows you to precisely time what goes on in your slideshow. And there are three forms of keyframing inside ProShow Producer, and that is motion keyframing, we've got effects keyframing, and caption keyframing. And each one of them is going to work in a very similar fashion. It's all about controlling the timing of your slideshow. So at the beginning, what we're going to do is focus on motion keyframing at the beginning, at least when we're explaining what keyframing is and how we can use it, because I think that's the easiest one to actually see. So we'll get started with that. We'll go through an actual example of how you can use motion keyframing, and then we'll go into the other two types. We'll do effects keyframing, and we'll also do caption keyframing. So before we get started, what I want to do is play through the three examples that we're going to be creating today. And that way you kind of have an idea of what we're headed towards in this class and what you're going to be able to create by the end of this class. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and play through these three examples. Now the first example is going to be an example of motion keyframing. The second example is an example of effects keyframing. And the third is going to be an example of caption keyframing. So keep in mind that we are transmitting all of this online, so if it looks a little bit choppy, don't worry. It's just because of the delay between seeing what's going on my screen and it arriving at your computer screen. So in the playback, in the recorded class, it should look better, and then when you create these examples on your own, it should look much better. Okay, so I'm going to scrub through these timelines here just to show you once again what these effects look like kind of in slow motion. So for the first example, we've got kind of a wooded background, and we start to see a leaf at the top portion of the screen, and it's sort of rotating down to the left side of the screen, and it's got kind of a, I guess it's a clockwise rotation. And then once it gets to the left side, it kind of pauses for a moment and starts to drift in sort of a counterclockwise direction. Alright, so this leaf is what is going to be using the keyframe. We have a complex motion path that we're going to be creating. Now the second slide, you'll notice, looks exactly the same, but in this case our leaf starts to change color as it falls to the ground. It starts out green and starts to turn kind of an orangey red. You'll also notice that at this point the background starts to lighten and it looks much brighter. Alright, so this is effects keyframing. It's going to allow us to change the color of that leaf. And it takes a very good slide, which was the first slide, and makes it just a little bit better, because in the second slide, you know, we've got that whole metaphor, the leaf's changing color as it falls to the ground. And then we've got our third example, and here we've got an image of London floating on top of a background, and we see the word London appear. And then we start to see this bright red circle start to appear and enter the screen, and it comes to rest right on top of the British Isles. And then it stays there throughout the rest of the slide. So we're going to use caption keyframing to create this slide. Alright, so now that we've seen these examples, let's get started working on our own examples. So I've got a question. How many of you have, in this version of ProShow, whether you're using ProShow Producer or whether you're using ProShow Gold and just upgraded to Producer, how many of you have created any sort of motion in the program, added any sort of panning, zooming, or rotation? If you have, click the hand icon to raise your hand. Awesome. Looks like at least more than half of you have done that before. So when you, thank you, I'll go ahead and lower your hands. So when you use motion, you're already familiar with the concept of keyframing, even if you don't know it. So when you create motion inside Pressure Producer, let's do an example. Let's take this London image, and let's drag and drop it into a slide. So if we double-click to open up our slide options, and we go into the Effects category, and we click on the Motion Effects tab. So what we have here is a starting point on the left side and an ending point on the right side. And if we, say for example, zoom out in the starting position to say 70, 60%, something like that, and then in the ending position we zoom in, we've set a starting point, we've set an ending point, we hit play, and ProShow does the rest for us. Alright, that is the concept of keyframing. We're telling it what we want to happen at the starting point, which is keyframe 1. We're telling the program what we want to happen at the ending point, which is keyframe 2. So by default, every single slide that you ever create has at least 2 keyframes, starting point and an ending point. Even if nothing happens in between those starting and ending points, you've got those keyframe points. So when you're working inside ProShow Producer, when we start to get into keyframing, we're starting to talk about having more than 2 keyframes. You can have 3 keyframes. You can have 4 keyframes. So instead of having one starting point and one ending point, you can have multiple starting points and multiple ending points. So let's say, you can see we've got sorry about that. So if you're used to creating motion inside ProShow, then you're able to use keyframes as it is. So we use keyframing inside ProShow Producer to help save us time and increase our creative options. So because we can have unlimited starting and ending points, we can create kind of complex motion paths. We can change the way our images look over time. We can also start and end motion. So say you want this image of London to zoom in to the way it looks right here in the ending position, but you don't want that zoom in to happen, you don't want it to be that large at the end of the slide. Say you want that image to zoom in that close halfway through the slide, and then you want it to stay still. Keyframing will allow you to create that kind of complex motion. So that is why we want to be able to do keyframes. It can, when you're working with adjustment effects, when you're working with the effects keyframing, you're able to make adjustments. So let's take a look at that adjustment effects tab. So rather than working with just the panning, zooming, and rotation, we can start to work with colorizing our layers, adjusting the opacity over time, and all of these other editing effects that we find in our editing tab underneath layers. But because it's here in our effects category, we can change these settings over time. And it's going to work the same with our captions. We can change the way our caption looks over time. We can change where its placement is. We can have our caption move across the slide. And we can also start to create our own sort of fly-in and fly-out effects using keyframing. So we're not limited to just those fly-in and fly-out effects that are included with the program. So before we get started actually creating effects, let's examine what it looks like to work with keyframes. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. I'm going to make my slide much longer. I'm going to make it 10 seconds. And I'm just going to change my transition effect to say 1 second long. Or not my transition effect, but my transition time. So we have a nice long slide time, a nice short transition time. So we're going to double click, open up our slide options, and take a look in the Motion Effects tab. Again, we're going to mostly explore how keyframing works in motion, and then we'll take those concepts and move them on to the different types of keyframing. So first thing you notice is in the preview windows, we actually see a preview of our keyframes. We can see we've got keyframe 1 on the left side, it's our starting position, and keyframe 2 there at the ending position. This is a new feature in version 4.1, so if any of you are using version 4 or earlier, your window is going to look a little bit different than mine. The concept is still exactly the same. The only difference is you're not going to see these keyframe numbers in the preview window. Alright, so underneath our preview windows, this is our keyframe timeline. So let me get my highlighter out and I will highlight that for you. This is our keyframe timeline. This is where you can edit and work with your keyframes. By default, again, you're always going to have a keyframe 1 and a keyframe 2. And that tells you when your layer will appear and disappear. Now down below your keyframe timeline, you can see kind of a grayed area, and it says slide time. This is showing you how long your slide is, but you'll notice at the 10-second mark, even though our slide is 10 seconds long, we still have some extra space here at the end, and that's our transition out. In your keyframe timeline, you're going to be able to see your slide time and your either transition in and or your transition out. So since this is the very first slide of our slideshow, we don't have a transition in. But we do have a transition out, and it's 1 second. All right, let me go ahead and clear some of this off. Okay. So, if you want to add additional keyframes, there's several different ways that you can do this. The easiest way to add an additional keyframe is on the left side, underneath where it says keyframes, right underneath the play button, you'll see there's a plus button. And if you click on that, it's going to add a new keyframe. And it's going to add that new keyframe right in between, halfway in between your first and second keyframe. Now that new keyframe is going to be keyframe number 2. It's going to keep the order of your keyframes kind of chronologically. You're going to go from smallest on the left to largest on the right. So even though you're adding keyframe 3, it's going to show up as keyframe 2 right there in the center. And that's just to keep things from getting too confusing. You can tell which keyframes you have selected because they're going to be highlighted in blue. If I want to add another keyframe in between keyframe 1 and 2, I click the plus button and it will add them halfway in between keyframe 1 and 2. If I want to add another keyframe towards the end of my slide area, I click in between keyframe 3 and 4, and you can see that I have those selected now. And I can click the plus button there. So now you see we have 5 keyframes. We've got quite a few keyframes. There are other ways that you can add keyframes as well. You can right-click anywhere in your keyframe timeline and choose Insert, and it will insert a keyframe right where you've selected. You can also right-click on a keyframe and hit Delete, and it will remove that keyframe. You can also double-click anywhere in your keyframe timeline, and it will add a keyframe right where you double-click. So if I want a keyframe at the 4-second mark, I can double-click, and we see keyframe 3 has been added there. If you accidentally hit the plus button too many times, or you start double-clicking and you accidentally triple-click and you get all these extra keyframes and you just want to go back to the way things were, just right-click anywhere in your keyframe timeline and choose Reset All. And it'll take you right back to only having 2 keyframe points. So it's these keyframe markers that are going to be set at a certain point in time. And when we have a keyframe marker, say we have keyframe 2 right here at the 2-second mark, we're telling ProShow what we want this layer to do at the 2-second mark. We can even right-click on this keyframe marker and choose Set Time for this keyframe. So if you want to set a precise time, you'll notice we're at 2.01 seconds. If we want it exactly at the 2-second mark, we can type that in and click OK, and ProShow will adjust where that marker is located. We can also click on the marker and drag it anywhere we want. And you'll notice that the tooltip that shows up when you click on that keyframe is going to tell you what exactly the time is that your keyframe marker is placed at. So we're at the 4-second mark right there. We can drag it over to the 6-second mark if we want, or we can simply right-click, choose Set Time, and type in 6. So you can be precise, you can be or you can kind of wing it if you want and drag it wherever you want. So you can move your keyframe markers, you can add them. Another button that's going to be important when you're working with your keyframes is going to be right here underneath your plus button on the left side. This is going to be the copy button. This allows you to copy settings in between keyframes. So we're going to be using that quite a bit, maybe not so much in this class, but as you start working with these keyframes, it's going to be very helpful for when you want to start motion and then stop it. You're going to want to copy those settings, because if your settings are matching in between two keyframes, then no motion's going to happen, no changes are going to happen. Some additional things that you can do with your keyframes is you can apply an individual layer transition. So as you know, there is a transition in and out for a slide. What you can also do is have an individual layer transition in. So let's say in this slide number 1 that we're working with, we don't want this image of London to appear until 2 seconds into the slide. What we can do is take keyframe 1, which remember keyframe 1 is what allows the layer to show up. We can take keyframe 1 and drag it to the right, say to the 2-second mark, or we can right click, choose set time, and type in 2 seconds. So now look what happens when we play the slide back. Our layer just kind of pops up on the screen at that 2-second mark. Something else you may have noticed when we started to play this slide back, notice that red marker at the bottom. That's your playback marker. You can also click underneath your keyframe timeline and drag. That's going to allow you to scrub through and preview what your layers are doing. So all you have to do is click right underneath the white area of that keyframe timeline, and that red marker will show up and allow you to scrub through and preview what you've done. Okay, so anyway, we're back here at the 2-second mark, and we'll notice if we scrub through, our layer just kind of pops on there at the keyframe 1. Well, you see it says cut. There's a flag right underneath keyframe 1 that says cut, and that's our transition in for this layer. So instead of our layer abruptly entering the screen, that cut transition, we can click on the marker and we can choose a transition effect, any transition effect that we want. And just like when you're choosing a transition effect for your slides, you can preview what the different transition effects look like. So let's choose something like big dots. Click on that. Okay, so now take a look at how our keyframe timeline looks a bit different. If I hover my mouse there in the middle of the keyframe timeline, you'll see there's a red outline. And our tooltip says transition in 2.25 seconds. So that tells us how long our layer transition is. Now if you look at the end on the right side, there's kind of a little bar there. And I can drag that bar to increase or decrease the length of that transition in. I can also right click and choose to set the transition time to say 1.5 seconds or something like that. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Now let's scrub through, and you'll notice at the 1-second mark our transition in begins, and then we start to see our layer. So what's cool is you can have multiple layers on your slide and have them start to appear at different points in time. So what I want you to think of keyframing as controlling precisely at what time you want your layer or your caption to do what. You're telling this image, I want you to appear at the 2-second mark, but I don't want you to abruptly appear. I want you to transition in until the 3.5 second mark. And then here at the 6-second mark, where keyframe 2 is, I want you to do this. And you can configure everything here in the keyframe 2 position. So it's all about timing. It's about precise timing. And what's cool is you'll notice, if you start to think about it, you could create an entire slideshow in one slide by simply using keyframing, using your layer transitions and adjusting all of that. I don't know if I would really recommend it, but when you start to watch some of the slideshows that Photodex does, some of our example slideshows, you know, they may be 3 minutes long, but it's only about 10 slides. Because we have these 30-second slides where we've got a lot of complex action going on, but we use these layer timing, these keyframe times, to allow different layers to come in and out at certain times. Because sometimes it's just easier to keep it all on one slide rather than make it too complex going in between slides. Alright, so just as motion keyframing works like this, so let me further show you this example. So here we've got keyframe 1, and let's say at the keyframe 2 position we want to go ahead and zoom in to about 100%. Let's just hit the undo and we'll go right there to 100%. But then we want that zoom in to stop. We don't want the layer to move anymore. So I'm going to click in between keyframe 2 and 3 to have those two selected. I'm going to go over on the left side underneath the plus button. We've got our copy button, which you see it shows 2 keyframes and an arrow. So we're going to be able to copy, and we're going to choose start to end. Now you'll see that my keyframe 3 settings match my keyframe 2 settings. So if we hit play to preview the whole slide, our layer transitions in, it zooms in, and then stops and stays still throughout the end of the slide. So what you would have to do in ProShow Gold or in very early versions of ProShow Producer, say version 2.5 when ProShow Producer first came out, is you would have to do this across multiple slides. Instead of having a keyframe 2 position right here, you would have to set that zoom in and zoom out for this slide. Then you'd have to copy the ending position of this image to the next layer or to the next slide and match those positions so that the zooming would stop. You'd have to have that cut transition, that 0-second transition. And so now you can kind of control everything all here in one slide, and everything's all nice and neat and contained. The same thing works with adjustment effects. You'll notice that the keyframes I set up in motion effects also show up here in adjustment effects. And that's just to make things easier for you. You don't necessarily want to have separate timing for everything, and you don't. This prevents you from having to have excess keyframes. So if we wanted, we could set up different colorization, stuff like that, for our layer. So say, for example, since we're zooming in from keyframe 1 to keyframe 2, perhaps what we could do is in between keyframe 2 and keyframe 3, we could have our layer go from very normal color, that kind of, it's blue, but you know, for the layer it's the normal color. And maybe in keyframe 3 we could colorize our layer and make it turn black and white. So then if we scrub through, our layer zooms in, and then once it gets to the keyframe 2 position, it starts to go from color to black and white. Alright, so you can enhance it that way, or if you wanted, maybe you could do something like have your layer start to blur, or do something like have the hue change or something like that. And the exact same thing is going to work in captions. You're going to have to actually have a caption in order to start this. So in caption settings, you'd have to type in something like text. Maybe zoom out on that just a little bit. But the same thing works for caption motion. Instead of having a transition in or a transition out, you have your fly in and fly out effects that you can control the timing of here in caption motion in your keyframe timeline. And again, you can control when your text appears. So maybe you want this text to be on the screen and off the screen. Oops, excuse me. I'm just trying to remove that fly-in effect. So maybe you want your text to appear on the screen and off the screen before your layer even shows up. So the first part of the slide just says text, and then it exits, and our image starts to appear. So you can precisely time how everything goes. So I think the best way to learn how all this keyframing works is to start with the examples. So let's get started with our first example, that autumn scene with the leaf on it. So we're going to be using this image, autumn scene. It's a JPEG. We're going to drag and drop that into slide number 1. We're also going to take this image, leaf 3. So select it, hold down your control key, and drag and drop it onto slide number 1. So we should have 2 layers. Let's double click to open up our slide options. We're going to go to the layers category and work in the layer settings tab. Select layer number 2, which is your autumn scene. If your layers aren't showing up in this order, you want to make sure your leaf is the top layer. It's a Photoshop image. You'll notice that it's transparent everywhere except where the leaf is. And then we've got our image, autumn scene. So with layer number 2 selected, go over on the left side underneath layer settings, and we're going to change the scaling of this layer to fill frame. We want this image to take up the entire background. Now select layer number 1, which is our leaf image, and we're going to change our zoom value on the left side. We're going to change it to 20%. We don't need our leaf to be quite as big as it is when you drop it into the program. Now let's go over to our editing tab. We've got just a few little changes to make. First thing you'll notice is that this autumn scene is much brighter than the way it looked in our original example, and the reason that is because in the opacity settings, underneath adjustments, we changed the opacity to 50%. So some of the black in the background is showing through. Now what this is going to do is allow our leaf to really show up and look really bright, and it's going to make it more noticeable that this is the focus of the slide. Okay, so now we've got all of our layers set up and they're all in place. Now it's ready to go in and start creating our motion effects. Let's go over to the effects category. We're going to click on the motion effects tab. Now we're going to be working with our image leaf 3. And what I usually do when I'm getting ready to set up some keyframes, I need to determine how many keyframes I'm going to need. So I want to kind of diagram out the motion path that my layer is going to follow. So I'm going to get a writing utensil here. We want our leaf to start up off of the slide. Let's draw a little circle there to represent that. Then we want our leaf to rotate clockwise until it gets about right here. Oh man, it erased all of my... Okay. We have our starting point. We want it to rotate clockwise until it gets to the left side of the slide. And then we want it to rotate the other direction until it falls off the slide. Alright? So, we need a keyframe 1 to start out our motion. And then we want it to go in one direction until we get here to keyframe 2. And then we want it to change direction. So this is a major point, keyframe 2, and then we want it to change directions until it falls off the slide, which is where it will end, and so that's keyframe 3. So we need 1, 2, 3 keyframes. So diagramming can be very helpful. I definitely suggest that you draw it out or plan it out before you get started adding keyframes and putting settings together. So what we're going to do is, actually before, one thing I didn't do was change the slide time of my slide here. I'm still working with a 3-second slide and a 3-second transition, so we need to adjust that a bit. I can do that right here within my slide options. Take a look at the bottom of my slide options screen. You see where it says total time, 6 seconds? You can click on that to adjust your slide time right here within your slide options. And this is on every single tab of your slide options window. You'll notice that transition in is grayed out. We're going to change our slide time to 10 seconds. And we're going to change our transition out to 0. And just click OK. Alright, so now our keyframe timeline accurately reflects how long we want this slide to be. So, underneath the left side, under the keyframes, click the plus button to add a new keyframe. So now we have 3 keyframes. We're going to start out working in between keyframe 1 and 2. Alright, so for keyframe 1, we can click on our layer inside the preview window and we can drag it up off the top right-hand side of the screen. We want this layer to rotate into place. We want it to rotate clockwise. So we're going to start out in keyframe 1 with a rotation of negative 360 degrees. So that when it starts rotating back towards a positive number, it's going to rotate in a positive direction, in that clockwise direction. Alright, now in the keyframe 2 position, which is our current ending position, I'm going to click on my leaf. I'm going to drag it over to the left side, like so. And you can see these motion path markers. It's telling me exactly what my layer is doing. Look in the starting position, in the keyframe 1 position, we have an arrow telling us which way our layer is going. Alright, so ProShow is doing its best to, let you know exactly what's going on. Alright, so again, back in the keyframe 2 position. Let's zoom in on our layer just a little bit. I'm going to change my zoom value to 45%. That's going to make me need to adjust where my leaf is located just a bit. I'm going to change the rotation value to a positive rotation. It's going to be 30 degrees, like so. Make sure all of your leaf is showing. It's in a good place. I think that looks pretty good right there. Now, let's click in between keyframe 2 and keyframe 3. In the keyframe 3 position, let's go ahead and change our zoom value. We want to continue zooming in because we're trying to work with perspective here. As objects get closer to you, they get larger. So we want to continue to zoom in. We're going to change our zoom value to 70%. And remember, we want our layer to start rotating the other direction. We want it to go counterclockwise. So we're going to go from a positive rotation, that positive 30 degrees, to a negative 100. And now we don't want our layer to show up right there in the middle, so we're going to drag our leaf off the bottom, kind of right side of the screen. Now it's okay if your the anchor points that go with your layer kind of show up, that yellow outline. As long as we don't see the actual leaf itself, it's okay. So with all of that done, I think we're actually good with our slide. It's as easy as that. It's as simple as setting up at what point you want your leaf to do what. So at the beginning of our slide, we want it off the screen. Halfway through the slide, we want our leaf on the left side. And we want it to go from a negative rotation value to a positive rotation value. So we're going to turn clockwise. And then at the end of the slide, we want after that keyframe 2, we want our leaf to start to turn counterclockwise. So we're going to go from a positive rotation to a negative. And all the while, we're getting larger. So if we click OK, we can play through our slide. And we can see it creates that nice, smooth rotation value. And one thing we didn't change, you'll notice here in our motion effects, is this smoothing effect. That's what allows us to have this kind of rounded motion path line. If we took our smoothing down to 0, you'll notice it starts to change our motion path line. If we move it up to 100%, you'll notice it gets even more round. So because we have a 50% smoothing on all of our layers, that's how we get that nice floating look to the leaf. Like right here around keyframe 2, you'll notice it doesn't abruptly change directions. It sort of subtly changes directions. And that's what smoothing allows us to do. Alright? Okay. So one thing that we were working with that you may or may have not have noticed is some settings that ProShow automatically sets for you. And there's basically two modes of settings when you're working with keyframes. You have an automatic mode and a manual mode. And they're pretty self-explanatory. ProShow will automatically detect a setting for you, or you can manually enter the setting. So take, for example, let's do a quick example real quick. Here in slide number 2, we'll just drag and drop that picture of London once again. Okay, so once again, we had our layer start out small at the beginning and at the end end up at 100%. Alright, so we only have 2 keyframes. If we click the plus button to add another, look at keyframe 2. Keyframe 2, you'll notice that in the keyframe 2 position, ProShow didn't make my layer look like it looked at the beginning or at the end. What it did is it automatically calculated what the layer would be doing at this keyframe 2 point in time and put that setting here in the keyframe 2 position. So it calculated that at that point in time, if nothing else has changed, this layer should be at 68%. And anytime you see a green light, you see these green, in quotation, lights next to the settings in keyframe 2, that means you're in automatic mode. If I take my layer in the keyframe 2 position, in the ending position, and I drag it to the left or right, take a look, my pan value's changed to blue lights. That means I manually set that. I can go in, and where it's blue, I can click on the green again. I can click on the blue lights to change them to green, and ProShow will automatically calculate where that layer should be based on the settings in the keyframe before and after that point. So because keyframe 1, the pan position is at 0, 0, and in keyframe 3, the pan position is at 0, 0, by using the automatic settings, my keyframe 2 will be at 0, 0. But if I move my layer at all, it's going to change to automatic or manual mode. Same thing goes if I grab one of these anchor points and zoom out, I go to automatic mode here in the zoom value. If I click on the blue lights to turn them back green, it's going to take me back to that automatic 60% value. If I take the pan lights, change them back to green, it takes me right back to the center. So basically, automatic means ProShow's just going to calculate everything for you. If you want to manually change something, you can click on these lights and set whatever you want. Take the layer, move it up to the upper left-hand corner, zoom out, zoom in, something to that effect. And you'll notice it doesn't change keyframe 3. The first keyframe and the last keyframe are always manual. So you're going to have to set those yourself. Alright, so mostly the thing to remember. Take a look on page 5 of your notes. For quick reference, manual means you've entered the values for pan, zoom, and or rotate or any other settings if you're in adjustment effects or caption keyframing. First and last keyframes are always set to manual. So even though they're green or gray, that means they're manual. You always have to enter those values yourself. And manual is blue. You can hover your mouse over one of the lights in keyframe 2 and you'll see the tooltip appears. Blue is custom value. It's manual. Green, on the other hand, is automatic. That means ProShow figured out these values based on the keyframe before and after this one. And you can change any auto setting to make it manual. So just something to take note of. Occasionally you won't like what ProShow automatically figures out and you'll just change it to manual. You can just click on all those lights and then manually set anything that you want. Alright, so with all that covered, let's move on to our second example, which is keyframes with effects. And in this one, again, what we're going to do is we're going to take that slide that we already created and we're going to add some adjustment effects. So I'm going to click on slide number 1, right click, choose copy, right-click on slide 2 and choose Paste. So we've got the exact same settings. We don't have to redo any of those motion effects. Alright, let's double-click to open up our slide options. A few things we have to change. Actually, it's just one thing, really. Let's click on your Layers category. You're going to go to your Editing tab, click on layer number 2, and hit the Reset button next to Opacity. Take that back up to 100% opacity. Now, let's go to the Effects category. I'm going to change what we do in the notes just slightly. It works either way, but I think the notes kind of overcomplicate things and make you have more keyframes than you need. And I like to work with as few keyframes as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to start working with layer number 2. And layer number 2 is our background layer. And first thing, let's click on the Adjustment Effects tab. And what we want to do is have 2 keyframes, 2 additional keyframes. We want a total of 4 keyframes. And here's what we want to happen. Let me get my pen out. Alright, so we're going to use a timeline. I'm going to draw this black line. Alright, so we've got the start of our slide, which is keyframe 1. And we want our background to be at 50% opacity until we get to right here on the timeline. Say it's probably going to be about the 2.5 second mark or something like that, about right there. Okay, so at that point, we still want it to be at 50%. So we want it to stay at 50% in between point 1 and point 2. But then, after we get to point 2, we want our layer to go back up to 100% opacity. We want it to brighten up. So, from this point 2 to point 3, we're going to change our opacity from 50% to 100%. But then we want it to stay the same through the end of the slide, which we know is the last keyframe. So we need to have a 4th keyframe, and that's going to be at 100% opacity as well. So because we have keyframe 1 and 2, that keeps it at 50%. Keyframe 3 and 4 keep it at 100%, and in between 2 and 3, that's where our change is going to occur. So that's how you can use diagramming to figure out how many keyframes you need. So let's click the keyframe plus sign twice. Alright. Okay, now let's take a look at our notes. I just want to make sure there's not a specific time, which it doesn't look like it. Okay, so recall from keyframe 1 to 2 we want our opacity to be at 50%. So we're going to set keyframe 1 setting to 50%, and the keyframe 2 you'll see it's in automatic mode, but if we click on the setting and type in 50 you'll see it changes to manual. Now click in between keyframe 2 and 3. You'll notice keyframe 3 it's set to automatic. If we click on it, change it to 100%, it changes it to manual. So from 2 to 3, this is where it's going to get brighter. And then from 3 to 4, we want to stay at 100%. And if you want, you could do a quick copy, start to end, just to make sure everything stays the same. So if you hit play, or if we just, oops, excuse me, not mean to do that. You can scrub through, see our layer stays dark, and then it starts to lighten up, and stays that way through the end of the slide. Alright, so we've got our background moving for us. Now what we want to do is create that illusion that our leaf is going from, green, it's alive, to kind of a reddish orange where it's that lovely fall color. So click on layer number 1, which is our leaf. You'll notice we've already got 3 keyframes set up. So let's work with these keyframes that we've got to set up the color changes that we want. So make sure you've got keyframe 1 and 2 selected. in the keyframe 1 position, what we're going to do is we're going to enable the colorize option, and we're going to change the color to green. And you can kind of pick whatever hue, tone of green that you want. If you want it to be a little darker, a little bit more natural, you can do that and hit set color. So it starts out as green. We want to change keyframe 2, enable the colorize option, and let's change this one to something more of an orange tone. And choose set color. Now what you want to do is click in between keyframe 2 and keyframe 3, and we're going to enable the colorize option in keyframe 3, and we're going to change it to red, a reddish tone, and choose set color. And that's it. That's all you got to do. Click OK, and we'll hit play. And you'll see our leaf kind of automatically changes color. So we've created 2 of the exact same slide, but we took the second version and just started to add additional elements to it. And most of the changes that we made were fairly subtle, but you can use these keyframing effects to make subtle and kind of realistic changes to your slideshow. It doesn't have to be, just because you're doing complex motion paths and multiple keyframes in a slide, it doesn't mean it has to be extreme. You can still make it nice and professional looking. Alright, so that's how you can use effects keyframing. Let's move on to our final example, which works with keyframes and captions. So in this example, we're going to be using that London image that we're oh so familiar with. So we'll drag and drop that into slide 3. We're also going to be using this Europe map image. So select that, hold down your control key, and add it to slide 3. Alright, we're going to do another 10-second slide, so we'll just double-click, open up our slide options. Let's start out in our layers category. We'll even just go over here to the layer settings tab. I want my Europe map to be layer number 2. So I'm going to use my down arrow to make sure that Europe map is layer number 2. And you want the London city image to be layer 1. So let's take Europe map, layer number 2, and I'm going to drag it in the preview window over to the right side of my slide. And I want it to stay in the center, so look on the left underneath layer settings. Make sure your Y value, that second window, is still at 0. We want it right in the middle of the slide. We can drag that a little bit more over. Okay, now we're going to click on layer number 1, which is our London skyline look. I'm going to change my zoom value to 50%. We're going to make this smaller. And I'm just going to drag it kind of to the lower left-hand corner of my slide, about like so. Now we want to make sure that these 2 layers are completely separate, and a good way to do that is over in our editing tab. We can make sure that layer 1 is still selected, and we can add a drop shadow to that layer. If I click OK, you can see just by adding that drop shadow, it adds a little bit of depth and dimension to our slide. So we can definitely see the difference between the 2 layers. Alright, so we've got the basics of our slide set up. Let's go over to our captions category and get started. Alright, so in our captions category, the first caption we want to add is the word London. And we want to change the size of this to something smaller, but still large. We'll go with 75. And there's a font that was included in your toolkit for this class, and it's called The Art of Illuminating. I'm just going to browse through my list. If you don't have that installed, don't worry about it. Just choose any font that you'd like. That The Art of Illuminating just kind of works really well with this particular example. Alright, so I'm going to change the color to blue. And you want to enable an outline, and you want it to be white. So if your outline is set to any other color, change that to white. And we're also going to enable a drop shadow. And by default, the drop shadow is black. So you're going to want to change that to white as well. It just so happens that since I created this example earlier today, the settings kind of carried over. Alright, so we've got our font set, we've got the size, we've got an outline, a drop shadow. Let's go over to our Caption Motion tab. Now, under Keyframe 1, you'll notice that there is a flag. And so just like our layers can have a transition in, our captions can have a fly-in effect. And we can click on that flag to open up our fly-in effect options. We're going to choose that fade zoom in. So hit apply. And we want it to take 2 seconds for this caption to come in. So right now it's set at 1.5. I'm going to right click, choose set effect time, and set it to 2 seconds. Right there on the keyframe timeline. And that's about it. We're not going to do much else to this caption. It's a fairly simple caption. We've got the word London coming into view and then staying still. Let's go back over to our caption settings tab and let's add that O that we saw before. That's going to circle right on top of the British Isles. So I'm going to click the plus button to add a new caption. And it's going to be simply a lowercase o. Alright, we want to change our font. We're going to change our font back to Arial Black. Move that so we can see it a little bit better. We want to choose a font size that is gigantic, 360. We want it to be huge. We're going to take that giant lowercase o and we're going to place it right where the center part of the O is encircling the British Isles on the map. And we're going to, I'm going to remove that bold setting. And if that London has a bold setting, let's remove that too. There we go. I think that looks better. For some reason that bold setting was enabled. We didn't need that. Alright, so we'll take the O, place it there. We need to change the color. Let's change the color to red. Nice bright red. And again, we want to have that white outline and a white drop shadow. We can remove this fly-in effect. So just hit the reset next to fly-in. Now let's go over to Caption Motion. We're going to create our own fly-in effect for this layer using keyframing. Right, so what we want to do is click the plus button to add a new keyframe. And the reason we're going to do this is from keyframe 1 to keyframe 2, that's going to be our fly-in effect, our custom fly-in effect. So keyframe 1 is going to have lots of crazy settings, but keyframe 2 is going to be these default settings that we set over in caption settings. And then from 2 to 3, our caption's going to stay still. So that's how we're going to create our own custom fly-in effect. So we need to adjust the timing of our captions a little bit. We don't want the O to appear at the beginning of the slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on keyframe 1 and choose Set Time. We'll type in 1 second. Alright, and we're going to have a 2-second transition in, just like we did for the word London. So I'm going to right-click on keyframe 2, choose Set Time, and we're going to set our time to 3 seconds. So that gives us 2 seconds for our O to make its entrance. So in the keyframe 1, make sure you've got keyframe 1 and 2 selected. For keyframe 1, let's change the font size to something outrageous, like 1200. It's pretty outrageous. Let's set the rotation value to -360. That'll give us that kind of wild and crazy entrance. And let's set the skew to something just huge, like maybe 280. Alright, now notice keyframe 2, everything's set to automatic. If I click on all these lights and set them to manual, you'll notice that my O appears as it did in the Caption Settings tab. And that's what we want to happen. Keyframe 1, wild and crazy. Keyframe 2, normal. Now if we click in between keyframe 2 and 3, everything should match. If it doesn't, do a quick copy, start to end. And now we can click OK and hit play. And we add our own custom entrance for this slide. And that's something to keep in mind when you're working with captions, and even with caption keyframes, we're using a simple caption to act as kind of a marker in our slide. So we're using our caption for something as it's kind of an artistic accent rather than as a simple, boring text on our slide. So don't limit yourself to using captions as a descriptive function. You can use them to add creative elements to your slideshows. So hopefully, after working through these 3 examples, you can see how using keyframes allows you to precisely control the timing of your slideshow. And you can always still do your very basic slides that maybe just have a little bit of pan, a little bit of rotation, a little bit of zoom, something like that. But you can also go in there and start to create really unique effects. And it doesn't have to be too complicated. And you can create a really interesting effect like this leaf floating with simply having 3 keyframes. It's not like we're doing anything too complex with 10, 15 keyframes, anything like that. It's really very simple because ProShow does have a lot of power to it. It will, take your starting and ending position and do the rest for you. And that's the really nice thing about this program. So today we've discussed what actually is keyframing. It's setting points in time and telling the program what you want to happen right then. And we know why we want to use keyframing, because it's going to save us time, it's going to increase our creative options. We explored what the keyframe timeline looked like, took a look at layer transitions and how we can preview all of that. And then we went through our 3 examples. We got the first one with 1 layer, 3 keyframes, our leaf floating down. We have our second example where we have the leaf changing colors. We have the background kind of illuminating, getting lighter. And then we have the third example with the map of Europe, picture of London, the word London appearing, and then our map marker, that bright red O that lands over the British Islands. Alright, so hopefully you guys feel much more confident working with keyframing and get ready to start taking those advanced classes. So what I want to do now is go ahead and open up the floor to you guys, to any questions that you may have. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about keyframes or about other online classes. So feel free to just go ahead and type those into the questions box, hit enter, and that will send them over to me. Once again, if you don't see the questions area, all you have to do is expand your control panel, and you can do that by clicking on the white button with the 2 black triangles on it. Alright, so Alexandra asked, is there a way to lock time for individual keyframes if the slide time is increased? Unfortunately, Alexandra, what happens is when you increase your slide time, it's going to proportionately adjust the positioning of your keyframes. What you can do is inside, let me make sure I have the way this works correct. What you can do is say take keyframe 3 and you can add or remove time from the keyframe. So take a look. Let's make sure that this works, because I'm not sure I remember exactly how this works. But at keyframe 2, we're at 5 seconds. At keyframe 3, we're at 10 seconds. Well, we want the time between keyframe 1 and 2 to stay the same, but we want to add a little bit more time to keyframe 3. We want this slide time to increase maybe 2 seconds. So instead of 5 seconds in between keyframe 2 and 3, we want 7. So I can right-click on keyframe 3, choose Add Remove Time, and I can say time, I can say 2 seconds. And you can choose which keyframe you want to add it to, and then say OK. So now you'll notice between keyframe 1 and keyframe 2, there's still 5 seconds. But between keyframe 2 and keyframe 3, there's now 12 seconds. And you can do the exact same thing. You can right-click, choose Add Remove Time, and you can say -2 and take that right back to 10 seconds. That didn't work. I want to do -2. Okay. Huh. Well, I'll have to check that, but you should be able to remove time as well. It's certainly letting me add time, but for some reason, adding that negative should do it. Let me write that down. May have found a bug in the program, but you should be able to add time easily, apparently right now, but removing time doesn't work quite as well. It's going to keep everything proportionate, though, if you change the times without using that add or remove time. So, very good question, Alexandra. All right, Les has asked, how do you create continuous motion, such as a car traveling down the road? So I'm guessing Les, let me look and see what's in my images folder here. So it's to create continuous motion, it should be fairly simple. Well, maybe we could do it with that leaf picture. So if you want to do something like a car traveling down the road, we can take a look at this leaf, do something like that. I mean, what you could do is simply, have your leaf start on the lower right-hand side, have it end in the upper left-hand side, and maybe get smaller to create the illusion that you're, that perspective illusion. And then just hit play, and that should do something kind of like that. Is that kind of what you had in mind, Les? Creating motion, like a very simple path like that, is fairly easy. And then you could add, an image behind it of a road or something like that. The only problem comes in is if the road curves, you might run into some issues. But if you want just a very simple motion path, you just need 2 keyframes, starting position and ending position, and the program will do the rest for you. Okay, Alexandra, is total slide time 10 seconds only? Nope, you can change your total slide time to anything that you want. Total slide time is going to take into account your transition in, your slide time, and your transition out. So we could have a 3-second transition in, a 3-second transition out, and we could have a 25.668 second slide. So your total slide time is just the addition of your transition in, your slide time, and your transition out. So you can make your slides as long or as short as you want. It just happens to be in my slide number 3. Slide number 3, it's set to 10 seconds, but we can make that anything that we want. So if we wanted to make it 22.564, we can make it that as well. It's going to make our transition in a little bit different, but it's okay. Okay, and Les has asked, I am curious how the train motion was created on one of your gallery slides. I can look and see. I'm not sure which show it is. Do you know the name of the show, Les? Look in the gallery. Was it the Battle of Wilderness? I'm guessing it's just a simple driving across the screen sort of thing. And again, you can move this make it smaller, maybe have it start on the left and on the right. You know, have it move across like that. Enhance. Is it one of the demos? This one, the advanced motion effects? Perhaps? I'm not sure if this will play very well when we're on for the advanced motion effects, it may be keyframing that actually did that. Let me see if that will let me play using presenter. Yeah, it's going to buffer a lot since I've got this program taking up a lot of our bandwidth. Like that. I'm guessing less is what you're talking about. That was, I know that part was done using I'm guessing maybe some of that hit what you were looking at. I don't know if there's an actual train in there. Anyways, take a look, because oftentimes these shows, like I know right here it's going to tell you exactly how they created that slide, and if you see the exact part, take a look at what point in time it's at, and you can always send into our support department, ask how it was done. They're happy to answer questions like that, but if you've got the specific point in time, we can let you know, but most likely it's just simply a matter of, setting up the keyframe times and stuff like that. So, good question, Les, and definitely those shows are really good for inspiration, like coming up with ideas on what to do in your own slideshows. Alright, Alexandra asks, how to plan a slide to avoid retiming, time change. A lot of times that takes practice, Alexandra, just kind of planning out. A lot of our classes talk about just simply planning out, deciding what you want to do. And, sometimes you just have to do things the hard way and you end up changing your slide timing after you want to do that. And, it's not always the ideal way to go, but the program's pretty flexible in trying to allow you to make those changes whenever you want. I don't have necessarily this is the fail-safe way to avoid having to make changes, unfortunately. Yeah, I would say a lot of times with practice you'll start to be able to create slides with confidence where you don't have to go back and adjust that timing. A lot of what I do in regards to that is work with slide styles, and slide styles are a really good feature in the program. They're those pre-made effects that you can find, let's see, in the slide category, slide styles tab. So you can kind of use these to create effects, and then you can sort of reverse engineer how they were created after you applied the style. So say like coasting, or even something like a moving backdrop. You can hit apply, say OK, and then you can kind of go in, look in your layers category, look in your effects category, and kind of see what ProShow did to create that effect. And that way you can start to sort of mimic those own effects in your slideshow. Great questions, guys. Anybody else? Motion speed differences, sure. So when you go to your slide options, you're in the effects category, your motion effects tab. Down at the bottom, you've got your motion speed. And what these are is it tells you how fast you want the motion to take place. And there are 4 different types. linear, smooth, accelerate, decelerate. And it's really easy to see the differences in all of these. Oops, didn't want that pin. So, linear means that the motion is going to move at the same speed throughout the entire slide. Whereas smooth, which I believe is the default setting, means that at the beginning of the slide and at the end of the slide, the program is going to move the slowest. And in the middle of the slide, it's going to move the fastest. So it starts out slow, increases speed at the middle, and then starts to decrease again. You get that kind of bell curve look. Accelerate, it's going to go the slowest at the beginning of the slide, and it's going to start to move faster at the end. And then decelerate, it's going to do the opposite. So for me, for the most part, the changes are rather subtle, but they can make a difference, and depending on what you're looking to do inside the program, it's an interesting feature that you can kind of control how those things move. So definitely play around with the settings, see what works best for you. Les said, are you available to view and critique slides we have created? If so, where do we send them? Unfortunately, we don't have a service like that. I know that there are quite a few forums and stuff like that on the web that you can go and like get critiques and share slideshows and stuff like that. If you go and do, say, like a Google search for ProShow forum, the first one that shows up is really good. It's the ProShow enthusiasts. So definitely take a look at the ProShow enthusiast website. I've heard really good things about them. So I know they have like a general ProShow Gold, like sample shows and feedback, where you can post a link to your shows and get feedback. They do it in ProShow Producer too. So definitely take a look. They're good. I've heard good things about them. So cool. And Sandra, is there a way to make the red O caption move under the blue London layer? So it actually is moving under, oh, you mean the blue London image. No. Unfortunately, the way ProShow works right now, captions are always on top of your images. So at this point in time, if you make that O, using captions, there's not really a way to make it move underneath the image of the London skyline. It does move underneath the London caption, but not the actual London layer. So at this time, captions always sit on top of the layers. Good question, Sandra. Okay, and Alexandra said, tricks with captions to cover them with something else. Yeah, there's not really a way right now to add actual images or videos on top of captions. The only way that you can do that is to not use the captions feature. If you wanted text on the screen, you would use, maybe like an image editing program or something like that to create an image with the caption on it. So maybe in Photoshop you create, an image that says London. The only problem is you wouldn't be able to create the kind of effect like we did here with the skewing and the rotating and coming into place. You could kind of mimic it, but it wouldn't quite be the same. So there's definitely limitations to the program as far as mixing the order of your captions and your layers. I know that's something that's been suggested, so maybe someday you'll be able to kind of adjust those. What about to blur caption at the beginning? Let's see. I don't think there's a blur option in captions. No, there's not necessarily a blur option. You could maybe reduce the opacity, but that doesn't quite blur it. One thing that you could do is maybe a fly-in effect could kind of create something similar to that. But there's not a blur. That's a really good suggestion, though. Fade. There's not necessarily, I guess, at this point in time, a way to do that. So that's a really good suggestion, and I'll definitely pass that along. Yes, you can do opacity, Alexandra. And in the keyframe 1 or keyframe 2 position, you could take the opacity down to, say, 0. So, well, we can see what that looks like. Let's see. Got London coming on. Maybe that kind of does it. So it kind of fades into place. To put something over your O, you could possibly do that. I think the opacity change looks pretty good. It can be an interesting way to go about it anyways. So it's not quite so in your face until it gets ready to be right there at keyframe 2. So definitely worth playing around with those settings to see what kind of interesting effects you can create. Any other questions? Questions about this class, other classes, anything like that? Alexandra, how many keyframes can you have in one slide? As many as you would like. As far as I know, there are not any limits. So you can get pretty crazy with what you do with your layers. I've seen some with 10, 12. I'm sure you could do more. It just gets a little difficult to manage. Or maybe not difficult, but more challenging. Sandra asks, is the art of elimination automatically installed in the fonts? No, you're going to have to do that yourself. So let's see. I think I've got, if you look, say on my desktop, I've got my Intro to Keyframes class. If you right-click, it may not let you do that. But you're just going to need to drag and drop it into your fonts folder, which you should be able to find. Just go to My Computer, go to your C drive, or your main drive, if it's not C. Look in Windows, see where it says Windows, enable that, and then you'll just take the art of illuminating and you'll drag it right into your fonts. See, it said my font, it was already installed. So that's all you have to do to install the font. And once you install the font, it will show up in Persia. Good question. Alexander said how to align keyframes. Like if you're working with multiple slides, sure. What you can do, which is definitely covered more in depth in the advanced motion keyframing course. But take a look where it says keyframes, and then take a look 4th button down. You'll see that there is a keyframe marker with a magnifying glass over it. Click on that. That's going to open up your keyframe editor. You can see all captions and all layers, which are images and videos, that have keyframes associated with them. And you can use this keyframe editor to kind of align everything. You can set up the timing of your slideshow. So you can definitely use that keyframe editor, and it's not going to really allow you to adjust the settings at those keyframes, but it's going to allow you to adjust the timing of your keyframes, so where they're placed, stuff like that. But you can find that keyframe editor window both here in the caption motion and in the effects category in both the motion and adjustment effects tabs. 4th button down, open multi-layer keyframe editor. Align exactly. So let's say you want City 02 and Europe map to both come in at the 1 second mark. So I can select keyframe 1 for the Europe map, hold down my control key, select keyframe 1 for the London image. You can see I have both selected because they're both blue. Right click on either one and choose set time. And you can say I want to set it to 1.1 seconds. And then they'll move. Or let's say you want to take keyframe 1 and 1 of the city image and the Europe map, and you want to align them with this keyframe number 1 for the O caption. You want them all to be at the exact same time. I can right click on the O caption and choose align selected keyframes here, and then they'll move over. Alright, does that help, Alexandra? Alexandra said something like snap. There's not a snap feature, as far as I know, for aligning your keyframes, except for using this keyframe editor that way. So, and she said align the end of the transition exactly. It's going to work the same way. You've got your transition out set at the 2 seconds. You've got keyframe 1 set at 2 seconds. You can kind of use this keyframe editor to align them all at the 2 second mark. If I'm understanding what you're asking correctly. Okay. Okay, Alexandra said yes. Perfect. Good. Okay, Sandra. In reading layers, does Photodex automatically read layer 1 on top of 2, on top of 3, etc.? Yes. So, yes. So layer 1 is always going to be above layer 2. So if you want layer 2 above layer 1, you have to use the arrows in your layers list to adjust those. And it works the exact same way in your captions as well. Even though they're not numbered, the top caption is always going to be above the lower caption. So, yes, you are completely right, Sandra. You're on the right track. Okay, Alexandra asked how to reposition layers faster. I don't know. I guess it depends on what you're trying to do, Alexandra. If you've got precise precise position that you want, you can do it that way. You can type it in. Otherwise, typing in the numbers of the position is the fastest way I know. If you have lots of them. Order of the layers. So you're wanting to change the layer order. So you've got like 10 layers on a slide, and you want to move layer number 8 to layer number 1. Using the up and down arrows is fast, right? Layer 1, you want to be number 9. Using them or moving them, using the up and down arrows is the fastest way I know. You can drag your layers in the list. So I can click on layer 1 and drag it down, make it layer number 2, stuff like that. But besides being able to drag them, that's about the best way I know. Yes, you can drag. Yes, ma'am. All right. Renaming layers. Absolutely, you can rename layers. So in your layer settings, right underneath where it says layer name and notes, if you want that to read, instead of City 002, which is the file name, you could call it Blue London, or whatever you'd like. And that's really helpful if you're working with duplicates of the same layer that do different things in a slide. Being able to rename them is nice. And that's pretty cool. And Alexander asks, what are layer notes good for? They can be good for a number of things. It's really up to you. If you're doing some like maybe complex effects with lots of copies of the exact same image, being able to add a unique name to that layer and being able to add notes about the layer can help. It's especially good if you're collaborating with other people and want to be able to share information about a certain layer. Can you see notes somewhere else? I'm guessing you mean like, can I output just my notes or something like that so that it prints off on a sheet or something like that? Yeah. As far as I know, you can't do that. That's a very good question. And as far as I know, you cannot. It's a very good question, though. I don't think that you can. I think it's just notes for use within the program. So it's a little bit different than when you have notes for, say, like a PowerPoint program or something like that. These are more creation notes rather than actual notes that go along with the presentation, with the slideshow. All right. Sandra asked, could you use keyframing to bring in layer 6 before layer 1? Oh, absolutely. Yes. Just because layer 1 is a higher order than layer 6, you could definitely bring in layer 6. And oftentimes, when we work with multiple layers and we have them come in one at a time, it's usually better to actually start from the bottom and work your way up, because you want the new layers to appear on top of the older layers, right? So you want the layer on top to come in last. So it would make sense, you want layer 1 to come on last. So absolutely, it seems like you've got the right idea, Sandra. So you're on a roll. Okay, and Alexander said, if you will copy the layer, will notes be kept somewhere else? If you copy the layer, where? Like if I take this layer and copy to a specific slide or something like that, I'm not sure when you talk about if you copy the layer to a different slide. So like you were to say, I think it'll probably copy the, we can look and see. Let's see. Let me see if I can figure out how to actually do this. So, let's see. I'm trying to think of something to say about that. We'll just say test. So, now you can see here on my layer that I've got notes about it. So, if we take this layer, maybe we want to copy it to slide number 4. I right-click on the layer and say copy to selected slides, which I have slide number 4, the next slide selected. Copy to selected slides. And then we'll say OK. So now if I look at 4, yep, it copied the layer notes over. So layer number 4, it's got notes. You can see on this image where I applied that slide style, the layer notes tell you exactly what happens. So it tells you that this is a duplicate layer, this is a supporting element, this layer is intended for portrait and landscape oriented, and then we've got the blue one in, which is test. Okay, Les, can slides be copied to another show? Absolutely. So I can take slide number 4, right-click, copy, and I've got this other show open that I created earlier. I'm using project mode. You're going to want to use project mode, so go up to project, and you can say new show in project, or you can add an existing show. We'll say new show. So now we have a brand new slideshow over here, and I can right-click and say paste. And it copied everything over. So yes, you'll need to work in project mode less, but as long as you're working in project mode, you should be good. And Alexandra, duplicating layer where it makes sense. If you want to do something like this effect, let me take slide number 4 here and let's remove that blue London. So something like this effect where we've got, you know, an image floating on top of another image. These are duplicated layers. We've got the exact same image floating on top of another one. So there's several instances, and quite a few of the slide styles, we've got duplicated layers. So in that one, in this coasting example, where an image zooms into view as it coasts across a dimmer full version of the same image. Doing things like maybe this display of 5, some of these display of 3, it's going to take the top layer and it's going to duplicate it and make it the background. So, you know, in these styles there's quite a few, and, you know, I've come across things like maybe this magnify effect where you've got, in quotes, a magnifying glass drifting across an image, enlarging anything shown under it. It's a mask that does that, and you know, you have to duplicate the layer in order to create the effect. So there's a number of reasons to duplicate a layer. Thank you, Les. All right. Okay, guys, well, we're about 2 minutes over time, so unfortunately we've got to head out for the afternoon. But thanks for coming. It's been a great class. If you have any questions between now and the next class, feel free to contact our customer support team. They are available to help you out 7 days a week, 8 to 8 Central Time. If you go to the Photodex website and take a look in the upper right-hand corner, there's a link that says Contact Us. And on there is all of our contact information. You can see 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Central Time. They've got a toll-free number, a local international number, a fax number, and even a way to email us directly from the website. All right, so feel free to contact our customer service team. They are awesome, and appreciate you guys being here. The video of the class should be available within about 24 hours. So take a look for that. You guys have a fantastic afternoon. We'll see you next time.